What I want to talk about in this video is whether the weather should influence the outcome of your trading. It's the US Open this week. We've had a few incidents this week related to the weather, and it's something I haven't talked about before, so that's why I thought I'd do this video. I also should mention that you must use BetAngel to trade tennis, because we've got so many features. We've spent an enormous amount of time, money and effort putting these features in, and it makes BetAngel a really outstanding tool if you're thinking of trading tennis. We've got an odds profiling tool, Guardian, which you can look at all the matches at once. We've got live scores flying in at a rate of knots, and you can even completely automate your tennis trading if you want to. So yeah, check out BetAngel, because it's really, really powerful for tennis trading. Anyway, back to the video. Please like or dislike the video, or leave a comment below. That will allow me to produce better videos and more of them in the future. So yeah, if you look at my feed on social media, particularly Twitter, you'll notice that I often tweet about the weather. And what I'm doing here is looking for a precursor to certain types of activity in a market. So, typically on, for example, golf, if the weather's going to be really poor, that will necessarily affect the outcome of a golf tournament. But what we've seen this week at the US Open tennis is there has been a lot of emphasis and focus on the temperature. So yesterday, I was trying to record a video on the Jo Konta match when she started hyperventilating and collapsed at the end of the court when she was about to serve, or getting very close to serve, potentially for the match. And that sort of just prompted me again and reminded me that I haven't really talked about those elements of sport, and particularly tennis. And it can come in many different facets here. But essentially, when you get heat in a tennis match, that will affect the way that the ball is being played. So you'll notice at Wimbledon, for example, they try and keep the balls a certain temperature and so on, and they change the balls every now and again. And they do that to have some level of consistency. But of course, if it's like 40 or something, as you sometimes get in the Australian Open, then necessarily that is going to affect things. And they had this problem with blistering on the court at the Aussie Open, I think it was a couple of years ago now, where the ball actually just wouldn't bounce in certain parts of the court due to the extremely high temperatures that they had. Now that's unusual, and that's typically not the effect that you have, but if you look at the physics of the flight of the ball, that will favour some people and not favour others as well. But typically heat on its own isn't a major problem, because a lot of these tennis players train in Miami, in Spain, and all of these places, and part of it is to acclimatise to warm temperatures, because the tennis season starts in Australia, moves across Asia, goes into Europe during what we call our summer, and then heads off to the US as we head into the later part of the year. So they tend to follow the summer around the globe. Tough job, eh? And as a consequence, most players are acclimatized to heat, but it's mainly humidity where that creates problems. If you get a combination of heat and humidity, that can give you heat stroke. And Jack Sock last year got into serious trouble at the US Open when players are always competitive at this level of sport, and they just won't give up, despite their body showing them signs that perhaps they will. And the effect can be dramatic. So if you have a player with an injury or appears to be suffering, then you will see that there's a significant change in odds as people expect them to retire. In tennis, retirements don't affect the outcome of the event from a betting perspective after the first set. So basically, if you're more than one set in and a player starts to look wobbly, or there is obviously something wrong, then that necessarily can send the price shooting out. Typically, it's injuries that create this situation. But nonetheless, when the conditions are right, then that can also have an important factor. So we had some high-profile casualties yesterday who were struggling during the heat and humidity at the US Open. So it's not unheard of. There's a brilliant tweet by somebody on my timeline on Twitter that just said, I've just been laying people with very red faces. And I had to have a slight giggle at that, because that probably is a good strategy. But it also prompted me, when I was looking at the problems that players were facing yesterday, to have a look at the retirements through some of the Grand Slams. And the interesting thing is that necessarily, well, I have a guess, which Grand Slam has the least retirements, based upon what I've just said. Do you any clues, any ideas? Well, it's Wimbledon. If you look at retirements on average during a Grand Slam, the rate runs at about 4%. So, just slightly more than one in 25 tennis matches have a retirement during the actual match itself. Now, it could be injury, illness, it's something to do with the temperature and so on and so forth. It's all in that mix. But 3.5% is the average retirement rate at Wimbledon. Now, if you go up a level from there, 4% retirements at the Australian Open, so a little bit higher. 4.2% at the French Open and 4.3% at the US Open. So the US Open does have more retirements in it. Now, I would have to dig even deeper and do a bit of research to figure out if that's weather related. But you probably suspect that it is, based upon the issues that they seem to have had at the US Open over a number of years. Now, also, there are other elements as well. So certain players have certain playing styles that would help or hinder themselves. And I remember when Andy Murray was playing Thomas Berdych at the US Open a few years ago. It was very windy. And by a complete coincidence, I'd gone to the ATP World Tour finals the year before and watched a number of players play. And one of the things I noticed that Thomas Berdych threw the ball really high when he went to serve, and that just seemed to be part of his playing style. I can't do that. When I play tennis, if I throw it really high, my chance of hitting it as it comes back down is about, sort of 1 in 10 maybe. So I tend to have a very short throw, and I tend to hit it quickly, a sort of Andy Roddick style. But Berdych was throwing it incredibly high, and that's fine if you're indoors, such as the World Tour finals were. But when you're outdoors, if it's windy, then obviously the ball is going to move a little bit, or at least you're not going to be as confident as you were when you were throwing it high indoors. So when the match between Berdych and Murray was at a critical point, they had to suspend it due to the weather. And they came back and they had very high winds. So necessarily, I just thought, well, that's going to really work against Berdych there, because his ball toss is so high. That's just going to be totally unsuitable for these sort of conditions. And sure enough, and Murray's a good outdoor player anyway, sure enough, that's how things pan out from there. So yeah, whether it's wind, humidity, rain for a certain extent, that can create a number of factors as well. But there was also a really interesting case at the Australian Open a few years ago where Roger Federer was saying that the shadow cast by the sun on the court on which he was playing was really annoying him, and it was causing him problems focusing and getting the length right on a few of his shots. So he actually sort of stalled and tried to delay as much as possible so that the shadow would pass. So it's interesting to see that even factors like that affect players, and even the best players in the world. Very interesting to read up and look at those things. And that's why it's interesting to listen to the post-match interviews, because very often they'll give you an insight as to which players seem to cope better with certain conditions, and they can be very, very insightful. And also listening to ex-tennis pros who are doing the commentary tends to be very insightful as well. Much better than a lot of pundits you see on football. So yeah, there are a number of factors that can play together in all of those sort of areas within tennis, and it's something that's worth watching because it's an individual sport. A team can't compensate for somebody that's struggling somewhere or something like that. It's a very sort of brutal sport in terms of if a player begins to struggle, then necessarily that will come into play, and the other player will attempt to exploit that fact. It's not like you see in a number of other sports where teams can compensate for one factor or another. It's very much a much more brutal game in terms of the way that you will be exploited if you're beginning to struggle on that. So yeah, it's worth looking at, worth understanding that in fact some of those factors can come into play as well. And we know that odds specifically go in certain jumps according to how many points are left towards the end of the match. But if a player is beginning to struggle, you will begin to pick that up. Maybe their service speed slows down, maybe they're making more errors, maybe they're not running for certain shots and so on. And you'll find that the market will start to price that in. You will begin to see some sort of variation on that based upon people's interpretation of how the match is affecting the player. But anyway, I thought I'd do that video because it's topical, relevant, and it's something I haven't covered before, and I hope that was useful for you. If you're interested in learning more about BetAngel, why not visit betangel.com today and download a free trial.